At my brother's rehearsal dinner, he gave a toast that brought the whole room to laughter, and every single word of it was about me. He held up his champagne glass, smiled at his future wife, and said that watching his little sister fail at everything she tried was what inspired him to become successful. The whole table erupted. His future in-laws dabbed their eyes. My mother nodded like he had just delivered a sermon. I sat there at the far end of the table with a bread roll I hadn't touched, and I smiled. I smiled because I knew something none of them knew. His restaurant, the one he'd been bragging about all night, the one he'd mortgaged his reputation to open, the one his future wife called her dream investment, sat inside a building that belonged to me. Not to a company with a name nobody recognized. To me. I just hadn't told him yet. Before I go further, let me tell you where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever had to sit quietly while someone used your life as their punchline, hit that like button, because this story is for you. My name is Diana, and at 31 years old, I have spent the better part of a decade being the family disappointment. That was the role I was assigned early, and I wore it without complaint because it served a purpose I was still building toward. My brother is 3 years older than me, and from the time we were children, the difference between us was made very clear. He was the one our mother introduced at church. I was the one she mentioned as an afterthought. He graduated with a business degree and opened a small catering operation that eventually became a full-service restaurant in the Midtown neighborhood of Atlanta. Our mother told anyone who would listen that he had her father's entrepreneurial blood. She never mentioned that the $40,000 he used to start that catering operation came from a wire transfer I sent through a shell company I'd formed at 24. I never said a word. I was a commercial real estate analyst, not the kind who shows up to open houses in a blazer. The kind who sits behind 3 monitors at midnight, identifying distressed properties, running absorption rates, and building acquisition models that institutional investors pay handsomely to receive. I had been doing this quietly since my mid-20s, first as a contractor, then as a principal in my own advisory firm. But because I drove a 7-year-old Honda Accord and wore clothes I ordered on sale, my family saw a woman who was barely keeping her head above water. They saw exactly what I needed them to see. 2 years before the rehearsal dinner, my brother came to me with a problem. His restaurant was doing well, but the building owner had decided to sell. The new buyer was a developer who wanted to convert the space into condos, which meant my brother faced losing the lease that made his whole operation possible. He sat at my kitchen table in the apartment. I kept modest on purpose and told me he didn't know what to do. He needed someone to buy that building, or at minimum negotiate a long-term lease guarantee before the sale closed. I told him I would look into it. What I did not tell him was that I had already looked into it. I had been monitoring that property for 14 months. I knew the seller's basis, the debt position, the tax situation, and the fact that the building's income was almost entirely dependent on my brother's lease, which meant the asset had very little market appeal to anyone who didn't already understand the tenant's business. I purchased it through an LLC I'd formed for exactly this kind of acquisition. The seller was relieved to close quickly. My brother was relieved when I told him I had found an investor willing to guarantee his lease for 10 years. He hugged me and said I was finally useful for something. I remember the exact words because I wrote them down that night. The lease I structured for him was detailed. I'd had my attorney draft it, and it contained clauses that were standard for commercial agreements but that most small business owners never bother to read. One of them, buried on page 11, addressed conduct between the tenant and the building's ownership entity. It stated clearly that any public disparagement, defamation, or reputational harm directed toward the landlord or its affiliates by the tenant or the tenant's household members constituted grounds for early lease termination with full acceleration of the remaining balance. There was also a clause tied to the right of first refusal I held on his business equity, a clause he'd signed to secure a low interest rate on a small operating loan I'd extended through the same LLC. He had never read page 11. I know this because when I asked him once, casually, whether he'd reviewed the full document, he laughed and said his accountant had told him it looked fine. His accountant at the time was a woman who did taxes out of a strip mall on Saturdays. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private event space his future mother-in-law had reserved. It was the night before the wedding, and the room was full of people I had never met but who had clearly heard plenty about me. I could tell by the way his future in-laws looked at me when I arrived that particular combination of pity and polite condescension that people reserve for someone they've been pre-briefed to feel superior to. I had driven myself. I wore a dress I liked. I sat where I was told to sit, which was not near the family, but at a side table near the back of the room with two of his college friends who spent most of the dinner talking about a podcast I hadn't heard of. I did not complain. I ate the salmon and watched the room. When my brother stood up with his glass, I assumed it would be the standard toast. Something about love and partnership and the journey ahead. Instead, he turned it into a comedy routine. He talked about growing up watching me chase one thing after another and never land anywhere. He mentioned the semester I dropped out of a graduate program, not mentioning that I dropped out because I had already been contracted by a firm that paid me more than the degree would have been worth. He mentioned the boyfriend I lost at 26, not mentioning that I ended that relationship because the man had a habit of spending other people's money. He described me, to a room full of strangers, as the kind of person who made everyone around her grateful they had made better choices. His future wife laughed the hardest. My mother, sitting at the head table, did not correct him. She tilted her head in a way that said she agreed with the general sentiment, even if she might have chosen softer words. I sat with my hands folded in my lap. I breathed through my nose. I smiled at the exact right moments so that nobody in that room could say I had reacted poorly. And when the toast was over and the applause faded, I excused myself quietly and went to the restroom, where I stood over the sink and looked at my own reflection for a long moment. Then I took out my phone and sent a text to my attorney. It said, "Can you be available Monday morning? I need to review the Midtown lease." She responded immediately. She always did. She said, "I'll have the file ready. Everything okay?" I typed back, "Better than okay. I just have some decisions to make." I went back to the table. I finished my dinner. I toasted the couple with a genuine smile because I have always known the difference between what I feel and what I show. When the evening ended, I hugged my brother and told him I was happy for him. He patted my shoulder the way you pat a child who has handed you a drawing you have no intention of keeping. The wedding was the next afternoon. I attended. I sat in the third row. I wore the same dress. His wife was beautiful, and the ceremony was genuinely moving. For about an hour, I set aside everything and just watched two people promise to build a life together, and I felt something close to hope for them despite everything. The reception was another story. At the reception, the toasts continued. His best man told a story about the two of them in college that made my brother sound like a legend. His new mother-in-law gave a speech about the restaurant and how it proved her new son-in-law was a man of vision and execution. She called it his restaurant, his building, his empire. She said her daughter had chosen a man who built things from nothing. I sat at table 9, next to an elderly uncle who fell asleep during the main course, and I thought about page 11. Monday morning, I was in my attorney's office at 8:30. I had the lease documents, the operating loan agreement, and a recording on my phone because in Georgia, one-party consent recording is legal, and I had recorded the rehearsal dinner toast on the voice memo app I always kept running at family events. My attorney listened to the recording. She read back through the lease. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "Diana, this is clean. You have standing." She paused. "You know if you exercise this, it will not be quiet." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're sure?" I said, "He called me a failure in front of 60 people he wanted to impress. He used my life as the punchline of a toast at his own wedding. He's been doing some version of this for 15 years, and every time, I've smiled and said nothing. I'm done saying nothing." She nodded and began drafting the notice. The letter went to my brother that Wednesday by certified mail and by email to every address on file with the lease. It was 2 pages long, professionally formatted, and absolutely devastating in its clarity. It explained that the LLC holding his lease had identified a material breach under the conduct provisions. It cited the specific clause number. It attached a transcript of the relevant portion of the toast. It stated that under the terms of the agreement, the landlord was exercising its right to accelerate the lease, meaning the full remaining balance of 8 years was now due within 30 days, unless the parties could reach a negotiated resolution. It was signed by my attorney on behalf of the LLC. At the bottom, in the reference line, it listed the managing member of the LLC. My name, I was at my desk when the phone calls started. The first came from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be my brother calling from his wife's phone because I had, anticipating this, set his number to go directly to voicemail. The voicemail he left lasted 4 minutes. Most of it was not coherent. He used the word crazy 7 times. He said I was doing this out of jealousy. He said I had always been jealous of what he built. He said his wife's family was going to sue me into the ground, and that I had no idea who I was dealing with. At the end, his voice broke slightly, which told me the reality of the numbers had started to land. The second call came from my mother 20 minutes later. She did not go to voicemail. She called my office line, which my assistant answered, and my assistant, God bless her, told her I was in a client meeting and would return the call when available. I returned it that evening. My mother's opening was, "Diana, what have you done?" I said, "I enforced a contract." She said, "You are tearing this family apart over a joke. Your brother was celebrating his wedding. He loves you. He was just teasing." I said, "Mom, he told 60 strangers that my life was an example of failure. He has been doing this in some form since I was 17. I have never said a word. I have smiled. I have written checks. I have made phone calls and pulled strings and done things for this family that you have never seen and never been told about, and not once has anyone in that room asked how I was doing. Not once." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I said, "Because I was raised to believe that making peace was more important than being honest. I'm done making peace that costs me everything and gives me nothing." She said, "You'll be alone, Diana. Money doesn't keep you warm." I said I'd rather be warm on my own terms than cold in a room full of people who use me. I hung up gently. I did not slam the phone. I had rehearsed this moment many times. By Thursday, my brother had retained an attorney. The letter I received from his legal representation was aggressive in tone and weak in substance. It claimed the lease clause was unenforceable because it was buried and unconscionable. It claimed I had engaged in predatory lending. It asked me to cease all collection action immediately or face a countersuit for tortious interference with business operations. I forwarded it to my attorney, who read it, and replied to me in one sentence. "They haven't done their research." She was right. The clause had been reviewed by 2 commercial real estate attorneys before the lease was signed. It was not buried, it was on page 11 of a 14-page document with a table of contents. My brother had signed every page individually. His prior attorney, the Saturday tax lady, had signed off on the document as the tenant's representative. The clause was enforceable, and my attorney said so in her response, which she filed with enough case citations to fill a law review article. His attorney went quiet for 4 days. During those 4 days, my brother tried a different approach. He showed up at my apartment building on a Saturday morning. I know this because my building has a camera in the lobby, and I have an alert on my phone. I watched him on the screen for 8 minutes while he argued with my front desk attendant, who told him with remarkable patience that I was not available and that he was welcome to leave his name and a message. He left a message. It said, "Diana, I need to talk to you. Please. It's me. I'm your brother." I did not call him back that day. What I did instead was something I had been doing quietly since Monday. I was auditing the operating loan he'd taken through my LLC, the one secured against his business equity. In reviewing the disbursements, my accountant flagged something interesting. Over the course of 8 months, there had been a pattern of cash withdrawals from the restaurant's operating account that didn't align with payroll, vendor payments, or any documented business expense. The amounts were not enormous individually, but together they totaled just over $38,000. I hired a forensic bookkeeper to take a closer look. She came back to me in 48 hours with a report that explained the withdrawals as a series of payments to a vendor called Premier Events and Catering Consulting LLC. The vendor had an address that turned out to be a UPS store mailbox. When she dug further, she found that the registered agent for Premier Events and Catering Consulting was my sister-in-law. My brother had been paying his new wife's consulting company out of restaurant funds partially secured by my loan, without disclosing it in his financial reporting to me. It was not just a breach of the lease, it was fraud against a lender. I sat with that information for 1 full day before I did anything. I made coffee. I went for a walk. I sat by the window and looked at the city and thought about what kind of person I wanted to be when this was over. I did not want to destroy my brother. I did not want to see him in prison. I wanted him to understand, clearly and finally, what the cost of contempt actually looked like. I sent the forensic report to my attorney. I asked her to add it as a supplemental exhibit to the existing breach notice. I also asked her to prepare a separate demand letter regarding the loan irregularities. And I asked her to schedule a meeting, not a phone call, a meeting at my office the following Tuesday. I wanted my brother, his wife, and their attorney in the same room with me. He came. I don't think he wanted to, but when his attorney reviewed the supplemental exhibit and saw the forensic bookkeeper's findings, she apparently advised him that avoiding the meeting was not a strategy that would serve him well. They arrived at my office at 10 in the morning. My brother walked in wearing the same blazer he'd worn to the rehearsal dinner, which told me he'd dressed to project confidence. His wife stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed, her expression already arranged into something between defiance and concern. Their attorney was a man in his 50s who shook my hand firmly and looked around the office with an expression I recognized the look of someone recalibrating their assumptions. My office is not flashy. It is not trying to impress anyone. But it is clean and organized, and the view from the 14th floor is clear enough that you can see the building in Midtown where my brother's restaurant operates, the building that appears in the lease documents as property of the LLC, which appears in the LLC documents as managed by me. I had framed one item on the wall behind my desk. Not a diploma, not an award. It was a simple printed copy of the property record showing the current assessed value of the Midtown building. My brother saw it when he sat down. I watched his eyes find it and stay there for a moment too long. I did not make small talk. I said, "Thank you for coming. I want to show you something before we discuss the legal matters." I turned my monitor toward them. On it was a spreadsheet, clean, color-coded, and very easy to read. It showed, on one side, every dollar I had ever transferred, loaned, or invested into my brother's businesses and our family, going back 7 years. The initial $40,000 for the catering company, the building acquisition, the operating loan, the time I quietly paid our mother's medical bill after she refused to tell anyone she couldn't cover it, the time I settled a vendor dispute for him without being asked, when I learned through a mutual contact that he was about to be sued. The total was just under $400,000. On the other side of the spreadsheet was a list of every documented instance I had personally recorded or received in writing where my brother had described me to others as struggling, failing, or otherwise beneath him. I hadn't done this to be theatrical. I had done it because I knew this conversation was coming someday, and I wanted to have the receipts. His wife was the first to speak. She said, "This is insane. You've been keeping a file on your own brother?" I said, "I keep records on all my investments. He is both." His attorney put a hand on the table to signal his clients to be quiet. He said, "Miss Diana, what is it exactly that you want here?" I said, "I want 2 things. First, I want a full audit of the restaurant accounts, conducted by an independent CPA of my choosing, to determine the full scope of the payments made to Premier Events and Catering. Whatever the true total is, I want it repaid to the LLC within 90 days. Second, I want an amended lease, renegotiated in good faith, that reflects current market rates and removes the personal guarantee provisions that are currently attached to my brother individually." His attorney frowned. He said, "Removing the personal guarantee would actually benefit your client, not mine." I said, "Yes, because what I want is for this to be a clean business relationship. No personal entanglements. No family obligation. No history. Just a tenant, a landlord, and a contract that both parties have actually read." My brother had been silent through all of this. When I looked at him directly, he looked away. There was something in his face that I had never seen before, not anger, not contempt, but something quieter and harder to name. Something that looked like it might have been shame, if he had been allowing himself to feel it. His wife leaned forward. She said, "You think you can just buy people? You think because you handed him some money years ago, you get to control his business forever?" I said, "I don't want to control anything. That's the entire point. I gave him money because he needed it, and I had it, and he was my brother. I expected nothing in return except basic dignity. He gave me a speech at his wedding about how my life was a warning. I think those are different things. She started to say something else. Her attorney put his hand on the table again, more firmly this time. There was a long silence. Then my brother said, very quietly, "How long have you owned the building?" I said, 2 years. He said, "Before that, when you found the investor, was there ever really another investor?" I said, "No." He looked at his wife, then back at me. He said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I said, "Because I wanted to see whether knowing would change how you treated me. I already knew it had when you didn't know." Another silence. His wife was staring at the wall. His attorney was writing something on a yellow pad. My brother said, "The toast." I was nervous. I didn't mean it to be cruel. I was trying to be funny. I said, "I know you think that. I also know that the things we say when we're trying to be funny are usually the things we actually believe. You have believed for a long time that I was beneath you. You learned that from our mother and you never questioned it. And every time I smiled and said nothing, I let you keep believing it." He said, "I didn't know about any of this. The money, the building, any of it." I said, "I know. That's what I needed you to understand. You formed your opinion of me on zero information. You dismissed me without ever looking. And then you repeated that dismissal in front of 60 people the night before your wedding, and you expected me to be fine with it." He didn't answer. The meeting ended with a framework agreement. The audit would proceed. The repayment schedule would be negotiated. The lease would be amended. His attorney, to his credit, was professional and kept the conversation from collapsing. When they stood to leave, his wife walked out first without looking at me. His attorney shook my hand and said something I thought was genuine. He said, "You've been very fair." My brother stopped at the door. He said, "I'm sorry, Diana." I looked at him for a moment. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Not physically, he was still the same person, but in the way someone looks when they realize the story they've been telling about themselves doesn't hold up. I said, "I hear you." He nodded and left. I sat alone in my office for a while after that. Not because I was sad. Because I was processing what it felt like to finally stop carrying something you've been carrying for so long that you forgot it wasn't supposed to be yours. The audit came back 6 weeks later. The total paid to his wife's shell company was $51,000. He settled the full amount in 2 payments. The amended lease was signed the following month. The personal guarantee provisions were removed. The relationship was restructured exactly as I had asked: clean lines, documented agreements, no assumptions. My sister-in-law did not speak to me for 3 months, and then she sent me a text that read, "I hope you're proud of yourself." I didn't reply. There wasn't anything useful to say. My mother called on a Sunday in early spring. She had heard the full version of events by then, because my brother had apparently told her everything, including the spreadsheet, including the $40,000, including the medical bill I had paid without telling anyone. She was quiet for a long time on the phone before she said anything meaningful. She said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Okay." She said, "I didn't see you. I didn't look. I thought I knew what you were and I never questioned it, and that wasn't right. I'm sorry." I said, "Thank you for saying that." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm better than I've been in years, actually." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I never knew you were the one who paid for my procedure." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "Because I didn't do it for credit. I did it because you needed it and I could. I just didn't want to keep doing things for people who used my silence as proof that I had nothing to offer." She said, "I understand." I don't know if she fully does. I think understanding that kind of thing takes longer than one phone call. But it was a beginning, and I've learned that beginnings are worth something even when you can't see where they lead. 6 months after the meeting in my office, I was at the restaurant for the first time since everything happened. I went on a Tuesday afternoon when the lunch rush was over and the place was quiet. My brother was in the back running inventory. He came out when the host told him I was there, and there was a moment at the door between us that didn't require any words, just 2 people standing in a space that had been rebuilt around honesty instead of assumption. He sat with me for an hour. We didn't talk about the lease or the money or the toast. We talked about a trip he and his wife were planning. We talked about a property I was looking at in Decatur. We talked the way siblings talk when they stop performing for each other. It wasn't perfect. I don't think it will ever be the version of a relationship that lives in greeting card commercials. But it was real, and real is what I had been building toward the entire time. Before I left, he walked me to the door. He looked at the dining room, the exposed brick walls he'd restored himself, the light fixtures he'd sourced from an estate sale, the tables he'd sanded by hand the first winter the place was open, and he said, "I built this thinking it was mine." I said, "It is yours. I just own the building." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a performance. It was the first time I had heard that sound from him and believed it. I drove home through Midtown with the windows down. Spring in Atlanta has a particular quality, warm but not yet heavy, the air carrying the smell of something beginning. I thought about the woman at that rehearsal dinner table, sitting alone with her bread roll, holding the smile in place. I thought about how much effort it takes to be invisible, and how much more you can build once you stop. I am not the person my family spent 15 years describing. I never was. I was simply the person they hadn't bothered to look at directly, which is a different thing entirely. I built in silence because silence was the only space they left me. What they never understood is that silence, when it belongs to you, is not emptiness. It is architecture. It is the foundation of everything you are still becoming. If you've ever had to build in secret because the people around you couldn't imagine what you were building, I want you to know that the foundation still holds. Keep going. And if you have a story like this one, share it in the comments. I read every single one.